We're here with Martin Hemingway, who is the Green Party candidate for Leeds North West. Thank you for coming in today, Martin. For students who are voting for the first time in Leeds, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you found yourself to be campaigning for the Green Party?
Background. I've lived in Leeds North West for 35 years, but my family's been in Leeds for the last couple of 100 years, so I know the city fairly well and various bits of it fairly well. I used to be a Labour councillor on Leeds City Council up until 2002, and then I found I couldn't defend Labour any longer and left, and the Greens was a natural place for me to go because I'd been involved in mainly environmental issues as a Labour councillor, recycling, waste disposal. I was chair of UK Nuclear Free Local Authorities and the Peace Council that the city runs.
The climate change issue is a huge issue for the whole of the UK and the world, but particularly amongst students as well. Could you tell us a little bit about what the Green Party are willing and are preparing to do to actually tackle the problem?
It's a basic existential issue, as you say, for everybody. And I'm old. It's not going to affect me as much as it's going to affect you younger people. Our manifesto for this election is 92 pages long, and slightly over half of it is concerned with climate change, because that is such a core issue. And one can break it down into sectors and areas. It's probably the best way to approach it. So, for example, if we started off with the energy sector itself, then our commitment is to a large extension of renewables, with one of the targets being to have 70% wind generation by 2030. But it also then links into other parts of our agenda. So, for example, with housing, we've got a commitment to build eco-standard council houses, social housing, 100,000 a year, because it's the only way we've ever hit housing targets in this country is by having council house building.
A lot of the policies and the kind of pledges that are included in your manifesto, they all work towards the 2030 target of achieving net zero carbon emissions. Do you think that is realistic, though?
That target is the one that we have worked to for some time. Our calculations are based on it, and it being achievable on that time scale, so long as we're willing to make the investment to achieve it. And it's such a significant issue. It's the thing that we've got to be spending our money on. And that's the reason why it's linked to so much in the way of borrowing.
And just leading on from that, your manifesto sets out to spend £100 billion every year for 10 years, which equates to £1 trillion, to fight climate change. How do you aim to get all that money, and how can you justify this big investment for something which may not potentially be achieved by 2030?
If it misses by a year or two, it's still got to be done. The point was in the first remark I made. It's an existential crisis. And if we have to borrow, then that is what needs to be done, if that's the way to do it.
So do you think there needs to be a bit of a mindset switch?
That is the biggest difficulty. In a sense, thinking about the death of the planet, if you were to put it in such terms, is much like thinking about your own death. You don't. And yet we can see it. We can see the films. We can see the methane bubbling up from the permafrost, the Arctic ice disappearing. All the evidence is there that it will go on and it will continue and intensify.
Will this money that you set out to spend in the manifesto, will it come purely from borrowing?
There may need to be tax cuts, but obviously there are also savings that are built into it, in particular in relation to defence. But yes, borrowing is probably going to be the most significant part of it.
What specifically do you plan to do in Leeds regarding public transport?
Obviously, what's being explored at the moment is the bus company and the extent of whether that can be brought back under local authority control. That's certainly something that the citizens' jury itself highlighted. It was their number one target that they came out with, and that's something we're pursuing. We'd like to see more railways opened, and the resurrection perhaps of some links. The link particularly out to Otley would be a very useful one to have back, and there are several others. So yes, we need to expand the rail service but also electrify it, because it's the main electric vehicle that most commuters use is the train, where electric trains are available. In relation to transport, we've got to have those alternatives, and to make those run more efficiently, we need to be making it less easy for people to commute into the major cities by car.
Would you consider making public transport more affordable as well?
Yes, there have been. It's one of those areas that's been discussed, and we're looking quite closely at some of those examples where it's become completely free. Luxembourg has done that now. And it's obviously something that will cause a massive shift.
In the manifesto, in the Greens manifesto, there's a plan to spend £2.5 billion on cycle routes nationwide. As you're the candidate for Leeds North West, do you know if there will be any proposed changes or improvements to cycling routes in Leeds?
We've come up with, as the Leeds North West Green parties, with some quite detailed proposals for cycleways. The important thing, because I do some cycling, quite a lot of us cycle, is that those cycleways are segregated. The bus cycle lanes that are shared with buses are not acceptable. Cycle lanes that aren't segregated, the ones running along Otley Road at the moment, are just marked off with a dotted line, so you don't. The drivers don't have to observe them. They park across them, and so on.
So we're going to move on to Brexit now, anticipated
How
topic.
unexpected.
Yeah. So the Green position, you're committed to putting it to a people's vote, where you'll campaign for Remain. How will you bring Leave voters on board?
It was difficult. It will be difficult converting people. People are converting themselves. Converting people just as it was before, because the argument for Remain is a complicated one. There are a lot of issues that need to be explained as clearly as possible, while a simple message saying, we're going to leave, is just that. And it appears to be a solution, but it isn't a solution to anything. Even if we did do that, it would only be the beginning of a whole set of negotiations and problems that would carry on for decades, probably.
So as you say, your position is campaigning for this second people's vote. What would actually be on the ballot paper?
We've always put it in terms of there need to be three options. Any deal that's been negotiated, Remain, and Leave. The Electoral Commission say it's not possible to run a referendum with three options. It can only be two, which would then become the binary of either Remain, Leave, or Deal, Remain. Whether it's logistically possible to run a three-way referendum is a separate issue. But it's not up to the Electoral Commission to decide that. It's up to Parliament to decide that.
So the tuition fees at universities, you're saying you would scrap tuition fees as well as writing off ex-students' debt who studied under the £9,000 a year fee regime. So the cost of writing off this debt would equate to £33 billion, according to economists. Do you feel like this writing off the existing debt is necessary, and could the £33 billion be better off spent elsewhere?
It's probably debt that shouldn't have been incurred. In a large part, it's debt that probably isn't going to be repaid. So it's debt that will in the end be written off. So dealing with it now, getting rid of it now, is a practical thing to do. But in terms of the actual, the psychology of the people who are faced with that debt, who can't embark perhaps on, if they wanted a family, which might be something they'd question at the moment with all the uncertainties, or even just buying things, is going to affect that decision making, because there is this vast amount of debt hanging over them, or in other cases just being ignored by them because it's just too big a thing.
There seems to be a quite strong likelihood of there being a hung parliament at the end of this election, where the Greens, if they carry on their momentum from the EU elections, where they doubled the number of MEPs brought to the European Parliament, if you carry on that momentum, there could be a chance that you play a part in any negotiations post-election. So with that in mind, what kind of parties, leaderships would you be willing to cooperate with, possibly strike up a pact or a deal with?
Well, we'd see it as being the parties of the left, probably with Caroline Lucas as Prime Minister, because she's certainly the most respected parliamentarian.
And just to finish off, in a couple of sentences, can you just state why students should vote for you?
Students should vote for us because we are the ones that are most concerned about the long-term future. We aren't just looking at the next year, the next 2 years, the next election, but we've got to look at what's going to be happening 10, 20, 30, 40 years down, and to be planning now for what could be happening then.
I've got a question. So with the political scene at the minute, a lot of people are saying that there's only the big three parties that you should vote for, otherwise your vote is wasted. So why should we actually put our vote into Green?
First of all, if you're confident that it's not going to make a difference in your particular constituency, so in at least 3 of the Leeds constituencies, Labour is the most likely party to win North West, North East and Central, and East as well. There are other issues with the Greens not getting votes in those cases, which is that the money that finances the Green parliamentary office, Caroline Lucas's office, is based on what's called short money, which depends on the number of votes we get nationally. So one of the arguments for not standing down unilaterally is that there wouldn't then be any funding for the work that's done in Parliament by Caroline Lucas. So the nearly 700,000 votes we got in 2017, the money that is linked to goes to funding her office. It was 1.1 million in 2015. We still only got one MP for 1.1 million votes.
Okay.
So yes, there are arguments. If you're in a genuine marginal, then yeah, you need to think about it. So if you're living in Pudsey, for example, where the Tory majority is a few hundred, then you should be thinking about it. But in Leeds North East, the Labour majority of 17,000, with a strongly Remain MP, who's also opposed to Trident, then you could vote Green quite happily without affecting it.
Thank you very much,
Great,
Martin.
thank you for coming in.